Imagine, the year is 338 BC, and the greatest civilization the world has ever known is about to breathe its last breath. Greece, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and everything we consider the foundation of Western thought, stands on a dusty plain facing annihilation. Not from Persian invaders this time, but from someone they considered barely better than a barbarian. A king from the harsh northern mountains who dared to dream of uniting what had never been united. In just a few hours, the screams of dying warriors will echo across Chaeronea, and when the dust settles, the age of free Greek city-states will be over forever. This is the story of how Greek freedom died, and how an empire that would reshape the entire world was born from its ashes. Before we dive into this epic tale of betrayal, tactical genius, and the birth of legends, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next, especially when we get to the moment that launched one of history's greatest conquerors onto the world stage. The Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC wasn't just another ancient conflict, it was a funeral pyre for an entire world. On that single sweltering afternoon, the very idea of classical Greece, the civilization that gave us democracy, philosophy, drama, and the heroic ideal, was put to the sword. This was the moment the old world died, and a new one was born in blood and bronze. For centuries, the Greek city-states had been a constellation of brilliant, fiercely independent, and often warring lights. They were like quarrelling siblings, locked in bitter and near-constant rivalries like the devastating Peloponnesian War that had pitted Athens against Sparta. Yet, in their finest hours, they had proven they could unite, putting aside their endless squabbles to form a wall of Hellenic defiance whenever a truly foreign threat appeared at their doorstep. They had shown the world their spirit at Marathon and Thermopylae, facing down the might of the Persian kings Xerxes and Darius. But now the enemy wasn't a Persian tyrant from a distant land. The enemy spoke their language, worshipped their gods, and claimed the blood of Heracles himself. He was, in a way they could never bring themselves to admit, one of their own. Philip II of Macedon represented something utterly alien and terrifying to the established Greek order. While Athens was perfecting the art of rhetoric in the agora, and Sparta was honing its warriors into flawless instruments of war, Philip had been quietly and methodically revolutionizing the very concept of power. In the harsh, mountainous crucible of his northern kingdom, he had taken everything the Greeks thought they knew about battle and turned it on its head. His army was not merely an evolution, it was a revolution. It wasn't just better equipped with the terrifying 18-foot sarissa spear, nor was it just better trained, though it was certainly both of those things. The Macedonian army was fundamentally different in its very soul. While the armies of Athens and Thebes were temporary assemblies of citizens, Philip had forged a permanent professional war machine of full-time soldiers whose only trade was battle. Their purpose wasn't to defend a city wall, it was to tear down the walls of the entire world. What makes the story of Chaeronea so profoundly tragic and so endlessly fascinating is that it was a civil war of ideas, a violent clash between two radically different visions for the future of the Hellenic people. On one side stood the grand tradition of the independent city-state, the polis. This was the world of citizen soldiers, men who were farmers, potters and stonemasons, who picked up a spear to fight for the freedom of their homes, their families, and the laws they themselves had written. Theirs was a world built on the ideal of liberty, of local autonomy, and the right of a free people to govern themselves. On the other side stood Philip's vision, a single, unified Greek nation, a Hellas bound together not by fragile alliances, but by the unshakable will of a single, powerful monarch. His was a vision of an end to the petty, self-destructive wars that had plagued Greece for centuries, replaced by a disciplined, organized, and singular purpose, expansion and glorious conquest beyond anything the Mediterranean had ever seen. The stage was therefore set for more than just a battle. This was a reckoning between the past and the future. It was a struggle between the beautiful, familiar chaos of Greek independence and the terrifying, cold efficiency of imperial unity. The old world of individual glory and civic duty was about to collide with the new world of professional armies and absolute command. And standing in the wings, a shadow behind his father's throne, was an 18-year-old prince, a student of Aristotle and a prodigy of war. He was a weapon being forged for a purpose no one yet understood, and on this day he would take his first step into history, launching a career that would soon make the entire world tremble at the very mention of his name, Alexander. To truly understand why the fields of Chaeronea became the graveyard of Greek freedom, you must first understand the man who made that confrontation inevitable. Philip II of Macedon, the Wolf King of the North, did not begin his reign as the terror of the Greek world. In fact, quite the opposite. When he ascended to the throne of Macedon in 359 BC, he inherited what most would have considered a poisoned chalice, a kingdom on the very brink of utter collapse. Macedon was fractured by internal dynastic rivalries, its treasury was empty, and its borders were being overrun. The Illyrians were invading from the west, the Paeonians from the north, and two rival claimants to his own throne were backed by the might of foreign powers. His kingdom was a wounded animal, bleeding from a dozen cuts, and surrounded by enemies who sensed its vulnerability like wolves scenting blood, circling for the final kill. For any ordinary ruler, this would have been the end. For Philip, it was the beginning of a legend. Macedonia had always been the black sheep of the Hellenic family, the odd one out among the great Greek kingdoms. While the Athenians were building the Parthenon and perfecting democracy, and the Spartans were forging the most disciplined military society in history, Macedonia remained stubbornly rustic and tribal. It was a land of rugged mountains and hardy peasants, ruled by a warrior aristocracy whose kings had to constantly prove their right to rule through personal strength and battlefield success, rather than by divine right or long-established law. The sophisticated southern Greeks of Athens and Thebes openly looked down on them, dismissing them as crude, semi-barbaric mountain folk who spoke a strange dialect of Greek and seemed more concerned with herding cattle and drinking unwatered wine than with contemplating philosophy or composing tragedies. To them, the Macedonians were a buffer state, a useful but uncivilized barrier between themselves and the true barbarians of the north. But Philip, who as a young man had been a political hostage in Thebes, had seen the strengths and weaknesses of both worlds. He saw something in the Macedonian people that the arrogant southerners had completely missed. The very harshness that made other Greeks dismiss his people had forged them into something unique. These were not part-time citizen soldiers who fought when their city called and then returned to their farms and shops. These were men for whom survival was a constant struggle, warriors by sheer necessity, hardened by a lifetime of brutal border conflicts with Illyrian raiders and Thracian tribesmen. Their ferocity was a raw, untapped natural resource. All they needed was a leader with the vision and the will to organize that ferocity, to channel it, and to aim it like a weapon at the heart of the unsuspecting Greek world. Philip's genius was multifaceted. It was as much political and technological as it was military. Having lived in Thebes, he had studied under the great general Epaminondas and had witnessed firsthand the devastating power of the Theban Sacred Band. He understood that traditional Greek warfare, for all its heroism, had become predictable, almost ritualistic. Hoplite phalanxes, the cornerstone of Greek armies for centuries, would march to a flat plain, crash together in a brutal shoving match known as the othismos, and stab at each other until one side's nerve finally broke. It was brave, it was glorious, and it produced heroes, but Philip saw it for what it was, tactically rigid and horribly inefficient. He looked at this system not with the reverence of a Greek traditionalist, but with the cold, analytical eye of a revolutionary. His first and most famous reform was to reforge the phalanx itself. Where the traditional Greek hoplite wielded an 8-foot spear, the doru, and carried a heavy, cumbersome shield, Philip armed his infantry with the sarissa. This new weapon was a monstrous 18-foot pike made of tough, flexible cornel wood, tipped with a deadly iron point. Wielded in 2 hands and balanced with a bronze counterweight, the sarissa transformed the phalanx. A Macedonian formation could project a nearly impenetrable wall of 5 overlapping spear points in front of its front-rank soldier. An enemy hoplite couldn't even get close enough to use his shorter spear or his sword before being impaled by multiple sarissae simultaneously. Philip also reduced the size of his soldiers' shields and lightened their body armour, making his phalanx far more mobile and capable of marching longer distances than any of its southern rivals. But the sarissa phalanx, for all its defensive power, was just the anvil of Philip's new army. His true, revolutionary innovation was the hammer, his companion cavalry. While most Greek armies treated their small cavalry forces as little more than scouts or flank guards, Philip, hailing from the horse-rearing nobility of Macedon, made them the decisive, battle-winning arm of his military machine. These weren't just any horsemen. They were the landed elite of Macedonian society, the king's companions, who were bound to him by personal oaths of loyalty and granted vast estates in return for their service. Equipped with the finest armour, long lances, and trained to charge in a tight arrowhead-shaped wedge formation designed to shatter infantry lines, they were a weapon for which the traditional Greek armies had no answer. The deadly coordination between Philip's infantry and cavalry was unlike anything the Greek world had ever seen. On the battlefield, the Macedonian army was a perfectly integrated, combined arms force. The phalanx would advance, its terrifying wall of spear points pinning the enemy infantry in place, fixing them in a death grip from which they could not escape. Then, at the precise, critical moment, Philip would unleash the hammer. The companion cavalry would maneuver to a weak point, a flank, a rear, or a gap in the line, and charge home, shattering the enemy formation and beginning the slaughter. It was warfare as a chess match rather than a brawl, a symphony of violence where every piece moved in perfect harmony. And for 20 years, Philip, the Grandmaster, used this revolutionary orchestra of war to play a funeral dirge for Greek independence. For over 2 decades, Philip used this military revolution to steadily and insidiously expand his power, becoming the master of a new kind of geopolitical warfare. He rarely staked everything on grand campaigns or dramatic risky battles. Instead, he preferred to nibble away at the edges of Greek freedom, employing a masterful and cynical combination of bribery, diplomacy, threats, and selective surgical violence. One city-state, crucial for its strategic position, would find its leading politicians suddenly enriched by a mysterious influx of Macedonian gold, freshly dug from the new mines Philip had conquered in Thrace. Another whose harvest was vital to its survival, would see the ominous dust cloud of Philip's army appear on its border just as the crops were ready to be brought in, a silent, terrifying threat. A third city, stubbornly resistant to his influence, might find its most anti-Macedonian leaders mysteriously assassinated, only to be replaced by a new council far more friendly to Philip's interests. He was a predator who understood that a single, glorious hunt was risky. It was far safer to slowly bleed his prey to death, one small bite at a time. While Philip methodically and relentlessly extended his web of influence southward, one man in the heart of Athens watched with a growing, sickening sense of alarm. His name was Demosthenes, and he was, by universal acclaim, the greatest orator of his generation. He was a man who had overcome a speech impediment through sheer force of will, famously practicing his speeches with pebbles in his mouth against the roar of the sea to become a master of the spoken word. His voice, when raised in the Nyx, the great open-air assembly of Athens, could move the notoriously fickle crowds to tears of patriotic fervour or roars of righteous fury with equal breathtaking ease. But Demosthenes was far more than a mere performer. Beneath the soaring rhetoric was the mind of a brilliant and deeply pessimistic political analyst, a man with an acute and unforgiving understanding of power dynamics. And when he looked north at the rise of Macedon, what he saw terrified him to his very core. Most of his fellow Athenians were complacent, blinded by the golden haze of their city's past glories. They viewed Philip of Macedon as just another in a long line of foreign threats, a provincial nuisance to be dealt with if and when he became an immediate problem. They were the children of the heroes of Marathon and Salamis, the city that had faced down the full, terrifying might of the Persian Empire at the zenith of its power. Surely this upstart king from the northern mountains, this so-called barbarian, posed no greater challenge than the great King Xerxes. But Demosthenes, with a clarity that isolated him and earned him many enemies, understood that Philip was a fundamentally different kind of predator. This wasn't a straightforward invasion. It was a slow, creeping, and deliberate seduction. Philip wasn't trying to conquer Greece with an army. He was trying to beguile it into submission, to make it willingly place the shackles on its own wrists. In a series of blistering, passionate, and increasingly desperate speeches, Demosthenes tried to tear the veil of complacency from his countrymen's eyes. These speeches, which would become legendary as the Philippics, painted a chilling portrait of a new kind of creeping tyranny, a despotism that disguised itself in the robes of friendship and Hellenic unity. He thundered that Philip did not want to rule Greece like a hated Persian satrap, with whips and chains and garrisons of foreign soldiers. That was the old clumsy way of empire. Philip's ambition was far more insidious and far more total. He wanted to be accepted as a legitimate Greek king, as the hegemon or leader of a united Hellas. He wanted to rule over willing subjects who celebrated his name, not sullen slaves who cursed it in secret. This ambition, Demosthenes argued, made Philip infinitely more dangerous than any Persian invasion had ever been. Xerxes had come with fire and the sword, his intentions brutally clear. Defeat meant slavery or death. The choice for any free Greek was simple, but Philip was far more subtle. He came bearing gifts of gold and showering cities with honeyed words. He offered peace to a war-weary Greece, partnership to its leaders, and protection from their traditional rivals. He was a master of political theatre, a wolf who had perfected the art of dressing in sheep's clothing. By the time the Greek cities realized that they had traded their precious chaotic freedom for the gilded cage of Macedonian security, it would be far, far too late to resist. The bars of the cage would have already closed. With every fibre of his being, Demosthenes pleaded with Athens to wake up before Philip's trap closed completely and irrevocably. He methodically exposed the king's strategy, arguing that his endless offers of alliance and peace treaties were nothing more than elaborate deceptions, a smokescreen designed to lull the Greeks into a false sense of security and prevent them from ever forming a coordinated resistance. Every city that fell under Philip's protection, he warned, was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Every new ally of Macedon became another forward base for further expansion, another dagger pointed at the heart of those few states, like Athens, that still cherished their independence above all else. He was isolating his future enemies one by one, ensuring that when the final confrontation came, they would have no one to turn to. But his prophetic warnings largely fell on deaf ears. The Athens of 340 BC was not the Athens of the Persian Wars. A generation of near-constant warfare, particularly the brutal Peloponnesian War, had left the city exhausted and deeply in debt. Many citizens were tired of conflict and yearned for a period of peace and prosperity, a peace that Philip seemed to be offering. Furthermore, the political landscape was dominated by old rivalries. Many Athenians were more suspicious of Theban power on their border than they were of the distant Macedonians. In fact, a powerful pro-Macedonian faction in Athens argued that Philip could be a useful ally, a counterweight to their traditional Greek rivals. Besides, Macedon was still far away, its king careful to avoid any direct provocation of Athens itself. The threat seemed abstract, the warnings of Demosthenes hysterical. Why borrow trouble and spend money on armies when there were more immediate concerns, like the price of grain and the funding of the next public festival? If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal moments, show your support by hitting that like button and ringing the notification bell. We're about to reach the point where all of Philip's careful planning comes to fruition, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when two completely different approaches to warfare collide. By the fateful year of 338 BC, the creeping shadow that Demosthenes had warned of had become a terrifying, undiscernible darkness at the very gates of Athens. Philip's methodical, patient conquest had reached its endgame. He had used a combination of diplomacy, bribery, and swift military action to seize control of the crucial passes of Thermopylae and subjugate the states of central Greece. His professional army was now poised for a final, decisive push south into Attica and Boeotia. The abstract threat had become horrifyingly real. The moment of reckoning that the prophet of doom had long predicted was finally at hand. For Athens, the time for debate, complacency, and political maneuvering was over. The city would have to make a final stark choice between a humiliating but peaceful submission to Macedonian authority or a glorious but potentially suicidal resistance. There would be no middle ground. Faced with this existential crisis, Athens, spurred on by the ceaseless, fiery oratory of Demosthenes, did something that would have been utterly unthinkable just a few years earlier. They sent an embassy not to Sparta, their old ally, but to Thebes, their most bitter and hated rival, with a desperate offer of a full military alliance. The irony of this proposal was so thick it was almost suffocating for both sides. These were two cities whose histories were written in each other's blood. They had spent decades locked in a brutal competition for dominance over central Greece. It was Thebes that had been Sparta's crucial ally in defeating Athens in the Peloponnesian War, and it was Thebes that had, in the intervening years, risen to become the dominant land power in Greece, often at Athens' direct expense. Athens had plotted against Theban interests, and Thebes had threatened Athenian security. The hatred between them was deep, personal, and generational. But as Philip's disciplined legions marched ever closer, these old, bitter rivalries suddenly seemed like the petty squabbles of a bygone era. Chilling clarity descended upon both cities. If they faced the Wolf King of Macedon separately, they would surely be devoured one by one. Their only hope, however slim, was to stand together. Demosthenes himself travelled to Thebes and delivered what was said to be the masterpiece of his career, an oration so powerful that it swayed the Thebans to set aside their long-standing enmity and join forces with Athens. The alliance that formed was not born of trust or friendship, but of pure, cold desperation. Yet, in its creation, it represented something genuinely magnificent, the last great defiant stand of independent Greece, a final heroic effort to preserve the flickering flame of its freedom against the rising tide of empire. The combined Athenian-Theban army that marched north to confront Philip was a living testament to everything that had once made Greek warfare legendary. At its very core were the citizen soldiers, the hoplites, who had formed the bedrock of Greek military success from the fields of Marathon to the shores of Plataea. These were men who owned their own land, who furnished their own bronze armour and shields, and who fought not for a king's pay or the promise of plunder, but to defend their homes, their families, and their way of life. They were not professional soldiers in the Macedonian sense. Their hands were as familiar with the potter's wheel or the farmer's plough as they were with the spear, but they were fighting for an idea, an abstract concept that Philip's professional conquerors could never truly comprehend, the right of a free people to govern themselves. The pride and undisputed champion of this allied force was Thebes' Sacred Band, an elite unit of 300 hand-picked warriors that was unlike any other military formation in the ancient world. They were the embodiment of the Greek heroic ideal. Forged in the crucible of Theban military reforms, these men fought in pairs, 150 couples bound together not just by the iron discipline of the Phalanx, but by the powerful, unbreakable bonds of personal love. Each warrior was paired with his lover, his Erastes or his Eromenos, creating a unit whose cohesion went deeper than mere military loyalty. The psychological theory behind their creation was as simple as it was profound. No man would ever show cowardice in the eyes of his beloved, and every warrior would fight with the ferocity of a demigod to protect the life of his partner. This emotional and tactical synergy made them a terrifying force on the battlefield. For nearly 4 decades, the Sacred Band had been, in a word, invincible. They were the shock troops who had famously shattered the seemingly unbeatable Spartan phalanx at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, a victory that had ended centuries of Spartan military dominance in a single afternoon. Since that day, they had never known defeat in a pitched battle. To the allied Greeks marching to Chaeronea, the Sacred Band was more than just an elite unit. They were a living symbol of Greek martial virtue. They represented everything noble and heroic about their way of warfare: peerless courage, unwavering honour, and the absolute willingness to die for a cause greater than oneself. They were the spiritual heart of the last free army of Greece. The Athenian contingent, while lacking a single unit of such legendary status, was equally impressive in its own right. These were the proud heirs of the men who had rowed the triremes at Salamis and charged the Persian host at Marathon. They were the physical embodiment of the democratic ideal of the citizen soldier, an army of farmers, craftsmen, and aristocrats who had put aside their civilian lives to take up their spears in defense of their city and its laws. As they marched, their generals spoke not of pay or conquest, but of glory, of liberty, and of the sacred duty to fight for the right to live under laws they had made for themselves, rather than to bow their knees and submit to the arbitrary will of a foreign king. This army of free men, led by its undefeated champions, was marching to face a tyrant, confident that the righteousness of their cause would grant them one last legendary victory. The army that Philip led south to the plains of Chaeronea was not just an army. It was the culmination of 20 years of relentless, obsessive military evolution. It was a machine, and every single component had been designed, tested, and perfected for one purpose, and one purpose only: brutally efficient conquest. Everything about this force was engineered for victory rather than glory, for results rather than honour. While the allied Greeks prepared for battle in the traditional way, with solemn prayers to the gods, sacrifices, and soaring speeches about duty and freedom, the Macedonians had a different ritual. They simply checked their equipment, sharpened their blades, and waited in disciplined silence for their orders. They were professionals reporting for another day's work, and their work was killing. This was not a citizen militia. It was the most dangerous military instrument the world had yet produced. At the heart of Philip's army was the Phalanx, but this was a far cry from the hoplite formations of Athens and Thebes. This was a different beast entirely. The men who wielded those terrifying 18-foot sarissæ were not farmers and craftsmen called away from their jobs. They were full-time professional soldiers who lived and breathed warfare. They trained constantly, drilling until the complex movements of the Phalanx became second nature, until they fought not as a collection of individual heroes seeking personal glory, but as a single, terrifying organism with thousands of limbs. Philip had deliberately lightened their armour, replacing the heavy bronze cuirass of the traditional hoplite with a lighter linen corselet and a smaller shield. This sacrificed some individual protection, but it gave his phalanx a mobility and endurance that no traditional Greek army could match. They could march faster, fight longer, and maneuver with a speed that often left their enemies bewildered. What they lost in personal defence, they more than made up for with their impenetrable wall of 5 projecting spear points and a level of coordination that was simply unheard of. If the phalanx was the unshakable iron core of the army, the real killing power, the instrument of decision, lay in its cavalry. The companion cavalry, the heteroi, represented everything new and revolutionary about Macedonian warfare. These men were the absolute cream of Macedonian society, the sons of the high nobility, who were bound to their king by sacred personal oaths that made them far more than just soldiers. They were extensions of Philip's own will on the battlefield, a perfectly honed weapon capable of executing complex high-speed manoeuvres that would have been utterly impossible for the less disciplined auxiliary cavalry of the southern Greek states. They were trained to charge in a dense armour-piercing wedge formation, to wheel and reform in the midst of battle, and to act as the decisive hammer that would shatter any enemy line held fast by the phalanx anvil. They were, in short, a force for which the Greeks had no tactical or strategic answer. Supporting these two main arms were a host of specialized, flexible units that had no real equivalent in traditional Greek armies, showcasing Philip's genius for combined arms warfare. Chief among these were the hypaspists, the shield-bearers, a corps of elite multi-purpose infantry. More mobile and flexible than the phalanx, but more heavily armed and disciplined than typical skirmishers, They were the tactical glue that held the army together. They could guard the vulnerable flanks of the Phalanx, hold a key piece of terrain, or exploit a gap in the enemy line with a rapid assault. In the years to come, under Philip's son, these elite warriors would achieve legendary status as the Silver Shields, one of the most famous infantry units in all of military history. This integration of heavy infantry, heavy cavalry, and elite light infantry created a balanced, flexible, and utterly lethal military system. Philip's deployment of this machine at Chaeronea was a masterclass, revealing both his supreme tactical genius and his absolute confidence in his commanders and his son. He took personal command of the right wing of his army, the post of honour, knowing he would be facing the experienced and highly motivated Athenian hoplites. This was no act of false bravado. Philip understood that the most complex and critical part of his battle plan, a dangerous feigned retreat, would be executed by this wing. It required a level of iron discipline and perfect timing that only he, their king and commander, could guarantee. His presence would not only inspire his men, but would allow him to personally manage the delicate high-stakes maneuver that would decide the fate of the battle. The crucial left wing, which would have the formidable task of facing the undefeated legendary Sacred Band of Thebes, he entrusted to his most trusted and experienced general, Parmenion. A grizzled veteran who had been at Philip's side since the beginning and had helped him forge the Macedonian army, Parmenion was a rock of reliability. If any commander in the world could stand firm against the finest infantry in Greece, it was him. His orders were deceptively simple but incredibly difficult. Hold the line. He was to absorb the ferocious charge of the Thebans, to give ground if necessary, but never to break. He was to keep the Theban elite occupied at all costs, pinning them in place while the real decisive action of the battle was decided elsewhere on the field. But the most intriguing, and in hindsight, the most historically significant deployment of the day was on the far right of Philip's own wing, positioned to act as the ultimate striking force. There, at the head of a force of elite companion cavalry, sat a commander who was just 18 years old and who had never held an independent command in a major pitched battle. This was Philip's son, Alexander. He had trained for this moment his entire life, studying under the finest minds and sparring with the toughest veterans. He had learned the theory of war from Aristotle, the practice from his father. But on this day, all the theory in the world was about to meet the brutal, bloody, and unforgiving reality of battle. This was his final exam, and the fate of Greece was hanging in the balance. When the signal horns finally blared across the plain of Chaeronea, the two armies that surged forward to meet each other represented more than just competing military forces. They were the physical embodiment of two clashing epochs. They were two completely different philosophies of warfare, governance, and life itself, about to collide in a single, brutal moment of truth. The allied Greeks, a magnificent but traditional force, had come to fight a battle as their ancestors had for centuries. They expected a contest of heroes, a brutal pushing match where courage, honour, and individual prowess would ultimately carry the day. The Macedonians, by contrast, had come not to fight a battle, but to execute a plan. They were the cold instruments of a new age, trusting in their iron discipline, their revolutionary tactics, and the flawless coordination of their combined arms machine to achieve a victory that was already, in their commander's mind, a foregone conclusion. The battle began with a terrifying, earth-shaking roar as tens of thousands of men on both sides let out their war cries. As the Greeks expected, it started with a massive head-on, collision of the main infantry lines that seemed to make the very ground tremble. For the first few minutes, the unfolding spectacle was a perfect, horrifying tableau of traditional Greek warfare at its finest and most brutal. The allied hoplite phalanx, a single, unified wall of bronze and courage, crashed into Philip's Macedonian line with a momentum born of desperation and righteous fury. The initial impact was a deafening cacophony of violence. The sickening crunch of spear points shattering shields, the high-pitched shriek of bronze grinding against bronze, and the guttural screams of men falling in the front ranks, trampled underfoot in the horrific, claustrophobic press of the infantry scrum. On the Greek right wing, the legendary Sacred Band of Thebes immediately began to live up to their fearsome, undefeated reputation. With the Theban general Theagenes at their head, they slammed into the Macedonian left wing, which was under the command of the grizzled veteran Parmenion. Fighting with a courage and skill that was almost supernatural, the 300 elite warriors and the Boeotian hoplites alongside them slowly, methodically, and unstoppably began to push back the Macedonians. These were men who had never known the shame of defeat, and they fought with the absolute conviction of their own invincibility. Every inch of ground was paid for dearly on both sides, but inch by bloody inch, the Thebans were making progress. They were grinding down and forcing back a professional Macedonian phalanx that was itself supposed to be the most formidable infantry in the world. Simultaneously, on the Greek left, the Athenian hoplites also charged forward with a tremendous, almost joyful enthusiasm. Their spirits had been fired up by the soaring speeches of their generals, who had reminded them of their ancestors at Marathon and their sacred duty to defend democracy. Convinced they were fighting for the very soul of their civilization, they crashed into the Macedonian right wing, the very section of the line personally commanded by Philip II, with all the fury they could muster. The citizen soldiers of Athens for a time proved to be the equals of Philip's professionals. The battle hung in a terrifying, brutal equilibrium as both sides became locked in the deadly embrace of phalanx combat, a monstrous pushing match where men fought for breath and leverage in a space so tight they could barely swing their arms, stabbing and shoving over a wall of shields and corpses. But just as the battle seemed to have settled into a conventional grinding war of attrition, the exact kind of battle the Greeks expected and were prepared to win, Philip revealed the masterful predatory genius that set him apart from every other commander of his generation. Instead of continuing to meet the ferocious Athenian charge head-on, he gave a quiet, prearranged signal. With a discipline that must have seemed incomprehensible to their enemies, the veteran regiments of his right wing stopped pushing forward and began a slow, orderly and carefully controlled withdrawal. To the excited and inexperienced Athenian generals, and indeed to any casual observer, it must have looked exactly like what they had dreamed of. The Macedonian line was beginning to crack under the sheer pressure of Athenian valour. This moment was the critical turning point of the entire battle, the hinge upon which the fate of Greece would swing. The Athenian generals, seeing what they could only interpret as the beginning of a rout, made a fatal hubristic decision. Intoxicated by the prospect of a glorious battle-winning breakthrough against the hated tyrant himself, they shouted the order to press the attack. Breaking their own disciplined phalanx formation in their eagerness, the Athenians surged forward in a chaotic, disorganized mass, desperate to be the first to strike the killing blow against what they believed was a retreating and broken enemy. In their breathless excitement, they began to chase Philip's withdrawing troops up a slight incline, a move that fatally separated them from the Thebans and the rest of the Greek line, stretching their own formation to the breaking point. They believed they were chasing victory. In reality, they were walking step by exhausting step directly into the jaws of a perfectly laid trap. Philip's feigned retreat was more than just a clever tactic. It was a symphony of deception, a masterpiece of battlefield psychology that required a level of discipline and trust that no other army in the world could have replicated. It was a terrifying gamble that hinged on two critical factors. First, his veteran Macedonian infantry had to possess an almost fanatical trust in their king, continuing to execute the difficult backward marching maneuver with perfect order, even as the enemy was charging and screaming at their heels. They had to believe that their king knew exactly what he was doing, even as every instinct in their body told them they were fleeing before an enemy charge. Second, the trap relied on the predictable, almost tragic nature of his opponents. The Athenians, Philip knew, were brave, passionate, and prone to overconfidence. He counted on them to believe that their own valour, and not his design, had already won the day. He was playing them like a master musician, and they were dancing unwittingly to his tune. The slow, methodical withdrawal of the Macedonian right wing was a multi-layered stroke of genius, accomplishing several critical objectives simultaneously. First, and most obviously, it drew the overeager Athenians away from their strong, cohesive starting position on the plain. With every step they took forward, they further separated themselves from their Theban allies on the other wing, stretching the entire Greek battle line until it was thin and brittle. Second, by deliberately retreating up a slight, almost imperceptible incline, Philip was bleeding the energy from his opponents. He was forcing the heavily armoured Athenian hoplites to advance uphill under the punishing Greek sun, all while in a state of high adrenaline excitement. He was exhausting them physically and emotionally, making them disorganised and far more vulnerable to the inevitable countercharge. But most importantly, the retreat was meticulously designed to create one specific, fatal opportunity, the gap that Philip had been planning for from the very moment he first deployed his army that morning. As the Athenians, now a disorganised and breathless mob, surged forward in their pursuit of the supposedly broken Macedonian right, they inevitably and irrevocably opened their own left flank. A wide, unprotected space now yawned open between the charging Athenians and the flank of the Greek centre, which was still locked in a brutal head-on struggle with the main Macedonian phalanx. This was the moment Philip had been waiting for. This was the single, precise point of weakness he had spent the entire battle patiently and brilliantly creating. The jaws of the trap were now wide open. When the Athenians were sufficiently stretched out, their formation in complete disarray, and their bodies aching with exhaustion from the uphill charge, Philip gave the signal his hardened veterans had been anticipating. Like a perfectly drilled machine, the entire Macedonian right wing stopped its withdrawal, planted its feet, lowered its sarissas, and turned to face its pursuers with a terrifying, disciplined fury. The Athenians, who just moments before had been screaming in triumph, now found their charge blunted against a solid, unmoving wall of spear points. The hunters had suddenly and horrifyingly become the hunted, now forced to fight for their very lives against fresh, disciplined troops on unfavourable ground, their momentum and their morale utterly shattered. But the truly decisive, history-making moment was happening where no one in the Greek army was even looking. Philip had deliberately positioned his son, the 18-year-old Alexander, on the extreme right of his own wing, a force held in reserve with one specific secret order: to watch for the gap. As the Athenian advance opened that crucial unprotected flank, Alexander was unleashed. With a roar that would one day be heard on the battlefields of India, he led his elite squadron of companion cavalry in their first legendary charge. This was the moment a prince became a commander, the moment a student of war became a master. The companion cavalry, an armoured fist of 2,000 of Macedonia's finest nobles, thundered across the battlefield, their hooves shaking the very earth. But they weren't charging the Athenians, who were now trapped in front of them. In a move of breathtaking speed and audacity, Alexander wheeled his entire force and drove straight like an arrowhead of steel into the exposed, unprotected flank of the allied Greek centre. These were hoplites who were already engaged in a desperate life-or-death struggle with the Macedonian phalanx to their front. They were completely unprepared for, and tactically incapable of defending against, a massive heavy cavalry charge smashing into their side. This was the hammer blow that shattered the Greek army and sealed its doom. No infantry formation in the ancient world, no matter how brave or how skilled, could survive a coordinated heavy cavalry charge into its vulnerable flank. It was a tactical checkmate. The Greek centre, which had been valiantly holding its own against the Sarissas, suddenly and catastrophically disintegrated. Alexander's horsemen smashed through their ranks like a thunderbolt, turning their ordered lines into a chaotic, screaming maelstrom of panic and death. The heart of the allied army had been ripped out in a single perfectly timed charge, and the great cause of Greek freedom was bleeding out on the dusty plain. With the Greek centre annihilated by Alexander's charge and the once proud Athenian army now completely broken and fleeing for their lives from Philip's brutal counterattack, only one coherent force remained on the field of battle for the allied Greeks. The Sacred Band of Thebes, which had been fighting their own victorious battle on the Greek right, slowly pushing back Parmenions' hardened Macedonian veterans, suddenly found the tide of battle turning against them with horrifying speed. The sounds of victory on their front were drowned out by the screams of panic and rout from the rest of their army. In a matter of minutes, they went from being the glorious spearhead of a Greek victory to a tiny, isolated island of defiance in a surging sea of triumphant Macedonians. They were alone, and they were surrounded. For any reasonable military unit in history, the next course of action would have been obvious and non-negotiable, an immediate and orderly retreat. The wider battle was catastrophically lost. The rest of the Allied army was in full panicked flight. To continue fighting now served absolutely no tactical or strategic purpose whatsoever. It was suicide, a pointless waste of elite soldiers who could be saved to fight another day. But the Sacred Band was not just any military unit, and these were not reasonable circumstances. For them, retreat was not an option. It was a betrayal of their entire identity, a violation of the very principles upon which their legendary status was built. Their code did not allow for survival at the cost of honour. These 300 elite warriors were bound by an oath and a legend that held them fast. For nearly 40 years they had been the undefeated champions of Greece, a living embodiment of Theban power and Hellenic martial virtue. They had never tasted defeat, and they would not learn how to on this day. But more than that, they were fighting for each other in the most profound and literal sense possible. Each man stood shoulder to shoulder with his lover, his closest companion in the world, the person for whom he would gladly lay down his life. Their bonds transcended mere military discipline. They were forged in the heart. To retreat now, to break formation and run, would mean abandoning not just their city and their honour, but potentially abandoning their partner to be cut down from behind. For these men, such an act was a fate far worse than a glorious death. The final, brutal phase of the Battle of Chaeronea thus became less a military engagement than a ritualistic sacrifice. It was a massacre, but it was a massacre that, in its horror, revealed the very best of the ancient Greek heroic ideal. Completely encircled by the full might of Philip's victorious army, vastly outnumbered, and with absolutely no hope of victory or even survival, the 300 warriors of the Sacred Band formed their final battle line. They dressed their ranks, locked their shields, and lowered their spears, preparing to meet their end not in a panicked rout but as they had lived, shoulder to shoulder, facing their enemy, defiant to the very last breath. They chose to turn their final moments on earth into an immortal testament to their love and their courage. What followed was both heartbreaking in its tragedy and awe-inspiring in its heroism. These men fought with a courage that went beyond the bounds of military logic, a fury born of love and despair. They stood their ground against the overwhelming tide of the Macedonian Phalanx, protecting their partners with their shields and their bodies, even as the circle of sarissas closed in around them, a tightening ring of inevitable death. They did not break. They did not flee. One by one, pair by pair, they died where they stood, refusing to yield a single inch of ground. They turned the last moments of their lives into an eternal monument to the values of love, loyalty, and honor that they had lived for, a final bloody poem written on the canvas of the battlefield. When the terrible work was finally done, when the last hero of the Sacred Band had fallen and a ghastly silence descended upon that corner of the field, Philip II himself is said to have ridden to the spot. As he walked his horse among the bodies of the 300 warriors, all lying together in a small compact space, and saw how they had died in their pairs, with their arms outstretched towards their partners, even this hardened, cynical conqueror was visibly moved to tears. He saw not just dead enemies, but a testament to a kind of love and loyalty he had never witnessed before. Surveying the scene of heroic sacrifice, he reportedly uttered the words that would become their immortal eulogy, a tribute from a conqueror to the conquered that would echo through history. May they perish who suspect that these men either did or suffered anything dishonourable. The Battle of Chaeronea ended in a complete, catastrophic and total victory for Philip of Macedon, but it was a victory whose consequences would ripple across the globe and reshape the course of Western civilization. In the space of a single, brutal afternoon, the proud military power of the independent Greek city-states, which had been the dominant force in the Aegean for centuries, had been utterly and irrevocably annihilated. The beautiful, chaotic, and brilliant dream of Greek freedom, the Eleutheria that had inspired the heroes of Thermopylae and the architects of democracy, an ideal that had survived the might of the Persian Empire and decades of ruinous internal warfare, finally died on that dusty, blood-soaked plain in central Greece. The age of the free polis was over. The casualty figures, grim and stark, tell a part of the story, but only a part. The Athenian army was shattered, with over 1,000 of its citizen soldiers killed and another 2,000 captured. Their losses were so severe that Athens would not field a significant citizen army for generations. The Sacred Band of Thebes was simply extinct, wiped out to the last man in their heroic final stand, leaving a void at the heart of Theban society that could never be filled. But beyond the immediate horrific tally of the dead and the captured, something far more precious and fundamental had been lost. What truly died at Chaeronea was the very idea that small, independent, self-governing communities could successfully resist the overwhelming power of a large, centralized and organized monarchy. It was the end of an era, a paradigm shift in the nature of power itself. Philip's treatment of the defeated Greeks in the aftermath of the battle was a masterclass in political statecraft, revealing a mind that was as sharp in the throne room as it was on the battlefield. His long-term strategy was not merely to conquer, but to rule, and his actions were calibrated with chilling precision to achieve that goal. He was brutally harsh with Thebes, the city that had so often and so stubbornly opposed his expansion, and whose sacred band had fought so fiercely. He sold many of its citizens into slavery, installed a Macedonian garrison on its citadel, the Cadmea, and forcibly dissolved the Boeotian League that Thebes had dominated. The message was clear. This was the price of total opposition. Thebes would no longer be a major power in central Greece. It would be a lesson, a warning to any who might consider defying Macedonian rule in the future. But his treatment of Athens, to the shock of many, was astonishingly lenient, and for one very good, very practical reason. Philip understood that he needed the powerful Athenian navy for the next, and far grander, stage of his ambition, the invasion of the Persian Empire. Rather than treating Athens as a conquered enemy to be plundered and humiliated, he approached them as potential, if unwilling, partner. He magnanimously freed all 2,000 Athenian prisoners without demanding a single drachma of ransom, and had their bodies escorted back to the city with an honor guard. He guaranteed the city's territory and allowed it to keep its democratic constitution and a significant degree of its traditional autonomy. It was a stroke of political genius, an act of calculated mercy designed to placate the proud Athenians and secure their cooperation. This was not the act of a benevolent ruler. It was the cold, hard pragmatism of a master strategist. Philip did not want a sullen, resentful Athenian population that would seize the first opportunity to rebel the moment his back was turned. He needed a stable and productive Greece to serve as the launching pad for his war against Persia. He wanted willing, if not enthusiastic, partners who would contribute their ships, their wealth, and their soldiers to his greater vision of a united Hellenic crusade marching east. By showing both the iron fist to Thebes and the velvet glove to Athens, he demonstrated the clear choice available to all Greeks: accept Macedonian leadership and prosper, or resist it and be crushed. With all organized military resistance finally and utterly broken, Philip moved with swift efficiency to institutionalize his victory and formalize his new role as master of Greece. He convened a great congress of the Greek states at Corinth, inviting every major city-state to attend. There he established what would become known as the League of Corinth. This new federation was, on paper, a mutual defense alliance designed to maintain a common peace among the Greeks. In reality, it united virtually all of Greece, with the notable and stubborn exception of Sparta, under the undisputed leadership of Macedon. The Spartans, in a final defiant act of pride, famously replied to Philip's invitation with the simple, laconic message: no. For the rest of Greece, however, the choice had already been made for them on the battlefield. The League of Corinth formally outlawed the endemic warfare between city-states that had plagued Greece for centuries and established Philip as the hegemon, the supreme military commander of all the combined Greek forces. He had finally accomplished what no Greek state, not Athens, not Sparta, not Thebes, had ever managed to do: the political and military unification of all of Greece. But he had not done it as an equal partner in a free alliance. He had done it as a conqueror and a master, and the age of Greek freedom had given way to the new, uncertain, and terrifying age of the Macedonian Empire. In the grand, sweeping arc of history, perhaps the most significant and far-reaching consequence of the battle of Chaeronea had very little to do with Philip's masterful strategy or the tragic end of Greek independence. The true legacy of that bloody day was not an ending, but a beginning. The battlefield served as the violent, fiery proving ground for the 18-year-old prince who had, until that moment, been living in the shadow of his formidable father. It was the day Alexander the Great took his first decisive step out of that shadow and into the burning light of his own legend. His perfectly timed, devastatingly effective cavalry charge had not just been a contributing factor in the Macedonian victory, it had been the decisive, battle-winning blow. In a single, thunderous charge, he had not only shattered the Greek army, but had also announced his own spectacular arrival on the stage of world history. For the young Prince Alexander, the Battle of Chaeronea was the ultimate visceral validation of his entire life's training. He had been raised from birth to be a conqueror, a living embodiment of the heroic ideals of Achilles, his supposed ancestor. The finest minds in the world had been assembled to shape him. His tutor, the great philosopher Aristotle, had taught him ethics, politics, philosophy, and science, moulding his intellect into a keen, analytical instrument. But it was the unforgiving crucible of the battlefield that taught him the brutal, practical realities of command, the grim arithmetic of life and death that cannot be learned from scrolls. In leading the elite companion cavalry in their first legendary charge, in successfully executing the most critical and high-stakes maneuver of the entire battle, he had proven not only to his father, but more importantly, to his father's hardened, sceptical veterans, that he was more than just a princeling. He was a true warrior, a born commander worthy of their absolute, unquestioning loyalty. The psychological impact of Alexander's stunning performance at Chaeronea on the Macedonian army simply cannot be overstated. It was the foundation upon which his entire future reign would be built. When Philip II was shockingly assassinated just 2 years later, in 336 BC, the kingdom was thrown into a moment of perilous uncertainty. In a ruthless monarchy like Macedon, a succession crisis could easily have splintered the kingdom into a bloody civil war among the powerful generals. But the army's willingness to immediately and unanimously rally around the 20-year-old Alexander, to accept him as their rightful king without hesitation, was largely forged on the plains of Chaeronea. The veterans remembered. They had seen with their own eyes that this was no untested heir. He had not merely participated in the great victory, he had been its primary architect, the one who had delivered the decisive hammer blow that had shattered the back of Greek resistance. They were not swearing allegiance to a boy, they were swearing allegiance to a prodigy of war. Time 1.0. Furthermore, this victory established the very tactical and philosophical template that would define Alexander's entire unparalleled military career. The potent, lethal combination of meticulous timing, an instinct for the enemy's precise point of weakness, and a profound belief in the power of a single, overwhelming blow, delivered with supreme personal courage. This was the formula he perfected at Chaeronea. The devastating flank charge of the companion cavalry, used as precision instrument to shatter an enemy line already fixed by the infantry, would become his signature move, the tactical masterpiece he would replicate and refine on a grander scale across the known world. In many ways, every great victory of Alexander's future conquests, from the banks of the Granicus in Asia Minor to the great plains of Gaugamela, and all the way to the monsoon-soaked shores of the Hydaspes in India, was a magnificent, audacious variation on the powerful war-winning theme he had first composed as a teenager at Chaeronea. The Battle of Chaeronea marked far more than a simple military defeat for the allied Greeks. It represented the definitive, bloody end of an entire way of life, the closing of a chapter in the human story. For a remarkable span of centuries, the Greek city-states, the polis, had embodied a unique and brilliant experiment in governance, society, and warfare. They were intimate communities, often small enough for citizens to know each other personally, to debate their leaders face to face in the marketplace. At their best, they were democratic enough for the individual voices of free citizens to matter, to shape the laws that governed their lives. And most crucially, they were fiercely, proudly independent enough to chart their own unique destinies, free from the dictates of a distant king or emperor. This was the world that died on that battlefield, a world of hyper-local patriotism and civic pride that would be replaced by the vast impersonal scale of empire. This remarkable political model, for all its flaws, had been the crucible for some of humanity's most profound and enduring achievements. It was the Athens of the city-state era that gave the world the radical idea of democracy. The philosophical inquiries of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and the timeless tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. It was the Spartan city-state that perfected the art of military discipline and the ideal of selfless devotion to the state, creating a legend that would inspire soldiers for millennia. Across the Hellenic world, from Miletus to Corinth, from Thebes to Syracuse, these small, independent communities had fostered an explosion of innovation, contributing staggering advances in science, mathematics, architecture, sculpture, and art that would form the very bedrock of Western civilization for the next 2,000 years. All of this brilliance had sprung from the fertile, chaotic ground of city-state independence. But this model, for all its glory, also contained fatal inherent weaknesses, and Philip of Macedon was the predator perfectly evolved to exploit them. The very independence that the Greeks cherished so deeply also made them pathologically incapable of long-term unity. Their endless, petty, and often ruinous rivalries, the constant state of near warfare between cities like Athens, Sparta, and Thebes, made any form of coordinated, sustained resistance against a unified aggressor nearly impossible. Their military system, which relied on temporary assemblies of citizen soldiers, was no match for a permanent professional army of career warriors who did nothing but train for battle. And most critically, in a world that was growing larger and more interconnected, the intimate small scale of city-state governance was simply too limited. They could never hope to compete with the vast human and material resources that a large, centralized and ruthlessly efficient kingdom like Macedon could bring to bear. Philip's overwhelming victory at Chaeronea did not just defeat the Athenian-Theban alliance, it served as a brutal, undeniable proof of a new historical law. The age of the small, independent state was over. The future no longer belonged to the free citizen of the city, but to the obedient subject of the king. It belonged to large, centralized states and sprawling empires that could marshal resources, raise armies, and pursue strategic objectives on a continental and even intercontinental scale. The Persian Empire, for all its flaws, had long demonstrated this principle of scale. But now the Macedonian kingdom, having fused Greek intellectual and tactical innovations with the absolute power of monarchy and the resources of a unified nation, had perfected it. The city-state was an evolutionary dead end, a beautiful but fragile creation that was about to be rendered extinct by a new, larger, and more powerful form of political life. Before we wrap up this incredible story, I want to ask you something that I've been thinking about throughout this entire video. Do you think Philip's unification of Greece was ultimately beneficial for Greek civilization, or was it a tragedy that destroyed something irreplaceable? The question isn't as simple as it might seem, because what followed Chaeronea was the age of Alexander, and the spread of Greek culture across the known world. The Battle of Chaeronea was both a tombstone and a cradle. It was a moment of profound and tragic finality, an ending that saw one of the most brilliant worlds in human history die in the dust of a single battlefield. But it was also a beginning, a violent birth from which a new and unprecedented age would emerge from the ashes of the old. The thousands of Greek hoplites who fell on that field, from the bravest Athenian citizen to the last hero of the Sacred Band, were fighting for a beautiful and powerful ideal that was, in the grand, brutal calculus of history, already becoming obsolete. They died for the notion that small, intimate communities of free citizens could, and should, determine their own fate in a world that was rapidly and inexorably becoming dominated by the vast impersonal machinery of empires. They were the last defenders of a world that was already gone. Their defeat was heartbreakingly tragic, but it was also, perhaps, inevitable. The very qualities that had made Greek city-state civilization so remarkable and so generative, its fierce emphasis on individual freedom, its passionate local autonomy, its celebration of heroic competition, were also the fatal flaws that made it so vulnerable. This beautiful chaos of independence made the Greeks chronically incapable of the kind of long-term, unified action needed to resist the methodical, coordinated conquest that Philip had perfected. They were a collection of brilliant soloists, suddenly faced with a perfectly conducted orchestra of war. The future, for better or worse, belonged not to the small and the free, but to those who could think, organize, and act on a much, much larger scale. The age of the citizen was ending, and the age of the subject was about to begin. Yet in its violent, tragic death, the old independent Greece gave birth to something the world had never seen before. Philip's victory at Chaeronea, the culmination of his life's work, was the necessary precondition for his son Alexander's conquests, and Alexander's conquests in turn acted as a historical tidal wave, picking up the seeds of Greek culture and scattering them across 3 continents. The complex philosophy debated in the schools of Athens would soon be studied and argued over in the great new libraries of Alexandria in Egypt and Pergamum in Asia. The scientific and mathematical principles discovered in Miletus would become the foundation for new learning in Babylon. The democratic ideals born in the chaotic assemblies of the Greek city-states, though extinguished for a time, would lie dormant, waiting to eventually influence political thinking from the Roman Republic to the founding of the United States. In the end, there is a profound and beautiful irony in the outcome of Chaeronea. In a way, perhaps both sides won something of what they truly valued. Philip achieved his life's dream of a united Greece, and forged the military instrument that would allow his son to become the greatest conqueror in history, securing his dynasty's place in the annals of power. But the Greeks, even in their absolute and crushing defeat, achieved a different and perhaps more lasting kind of victory. They ensured that their ideas, their art, their language, and their philosophy would outlive their political independence by millennia. The civilization that was supposedly extinguished on that dusty plain had, in fact, already planted the intellectual and cultural seeds that would grow into something far larger and more enduring than any single city-state could ever have achieved on its own. The young 18-year-old prince who led that decisive, world-changing cavalry charge would spend the next 13 years of his life proving a startling new historical principle: that empires built by the sword could also be conduits for ideas, for culture, and for a new form of shared human knowledge that could stretch to the ends of the earth. In conquering the Greeks, Philip had, with a beautiful and violent irony, inadvertently created the very instrument by which Greek civilization would, in turn, conquer the world. The Macedonian Phalanx became the vessel that would carry Hellenism from the Nile to the Indus. And that is the ultimate breathtaking paradox of the Battle of Chaeronea. In their desperate, heroic struggle to preserve their independence, the Greeks lost their freedom. But in losing their freedom, they gained a form of immortality they could never have imagined. Their ideas, their culture, their art, and their revolutionary vision of human possibility would outlive not only their conquerors, but every single empire that rose and fell after that fateful, tragic, and world-altering day in 338 BC. If this story of civilization, conquest, and the birth of legends has captured your imagination, please show your support by subscribing to the channel and sharing this video with fellow history enthusiasts. Let me know in the comments what you think about Philip's legacy. Was he the destroyer of Greek freedom or the architect of Greek greatness? Your thoughts and insights always make these deep dives into history even more rewarding,